Stop crying. Pack your bags and get out of my house. My daughter-in-law whispered those words beside my son's coffin, while the funeral flowers were still sitting in the living room, and half our relatives hadn't even left the driveway. Then Victoria leaned closer. David spent years carrying you. I'm not doing it anymore. I was 72 years old. My only son had been dead for 4 days, and the woman he married was already ordering me out of the house I had built with my own hands 37 years earlier. I could have corrected her with one sentence. I didn't. I simply looked at her and asked, "How much time do I have?" Please, before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're listening from today. My name is Thomas Mitchell. 4 days earlier, my 51-year-old son David had died suddenly. My wife Margaret had been gone 6 years, so losing him left a kind of silence I wasn't prepared for. After the funeral, everyone returned to 447 Maple Street, the house where David had grown up. I spent most of the afternoon beside the fireplace accepting condolences, while Victoria moved from guest to guest. At first, I barely listened. Then I noticed something strange about the way she spoke. David loved this house. David worked hard to maintain it. I haven't decided what I'm going to do with it yet. She spoke as though the property had belonged to him. I let it pass. It was my son's funeral, not a courtroom. Then I heard her tell a neighbor that looking after me had been one of David's greatest responsibilities. The woman gave me a sympathetic glance. I said nothing. By late afternoon, most guests had left. I was gathering sympathy cards when Victoria entered the dining room carrying a trash bag. Inside were several photographs of Margaret and me. I pulled out our wedding picture. "This stays," Victoria sighed. "Thomas, things are going to change now." "I know. I don't think you do. I can't support you the way David did." I looked at her. "Support me?" "The house, utilities, food." David never complained. "But I know how much you depended on him." For several seconds, I wondered how she had come to believe something so completely backward. Victoria took my silence as confirmation. "I've looked at Sunset Manor. They have space available. You want me in assisted living? It would be better for everyone." I looked around the room where Margaret and I had spent decades raising David. Victoria was discussing my removal as casually as changing furniture. "What happens to the house?" I asked. "I'll probably renovate and sell it." "You're sure you can?" Her expression hardened. "It was David's house, Thomas. I'm his wife." And suddenly my grief gave way to something colder, clarity. I had purchased the lot in 1987. I had financed the construction, my name was on the deed, and every property tax payment had come from my accounts. David had never owned 447 Maple Street. Not 1%. Victoria, apparently, had no idea. I could have walked downstairs, opened my filing cabinet, and ended the argument immediately. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the confidence with which she had spoken. Maybe it was hearing her claim David had supported me. Or maybe, after burying my son, I needed to understand how much of this false story she actually believed. So instead of correcting her, I asked one question. "How long do I have?" 30 days. 30? That should be enough to arrange Sunset Manor and clear your things out. I nodded slowly. "All right, 30 days. Relief crossed her face. She thought I had surrendered. Victoria picked up the trash bag and walked upstairs. I waited until her footsteps disappeared, then returned Margaret's wedding photograph to the mantel. For 37 years, I had kept records of everything important connected to this house. Deeds, taxes, insurance, payments, contracts. Every document was still downstairs. Victoria believed she had just given a helpless old man 30 days to leave her property. I stood alone in the house Margaret and I had built and decided there was no reason to correct her yet. Because before those 30 days were over, Victoria was going to learn the difference between believing you own something and proving it. The morning after Victoria gave me 30 days to leave, I came downstairs and found my wife disappearing from the house one photograph at a time. Margaret's portrait was gone from the hallway. Our anniversary picture had vanished from beside the staircase. Even the framed photograph of David at 12, standing between us with his first fishing rod, had been removed. In their place were empty hooks and pale rectangles where sunlight hadn't reached the wallpaper. Victoria was in the living room filling another cardboard box. "Where are the pictures?" I asked. "Storage." "Why?" "I'm preparing the house for an appraisal." She didn't even look at me. I picked up one frame before she could pack it. "That's David and his mother." "I know who it is, Thomas. Then why remove it?" She exhaled impatiently. "Because buyers don't want somebody else's family covering the walls." Buyers. My son had been buried 5 days earlier, and Victoria was already imagining strangers walking through the rooms where he had grown up. I carried the photograph back to my bedroom and placed it beside Margaret's wedding picture. By breakfast, Victoria had moved on to David's belongings. His old baseball trophies disappeared from the den. The wooden clock Margaret had given him after college was boxed up. A stack of letters he'd written home during his first year away was marked "Donate." "Those stay," I said. Victoria looked at the letters. "They're David's." "Exactly." She stared at me for a moment, then pushed the box aside. "Take whatever sentimental things you want. You can bring them to Sunset Manor." I didn't answer. Later that morning, I heard her speaking to our neighbor, Carol, near the front door. "I'm trying to make the transition easier for Thomas," Victoria said. "David handled everything for him. Bills, groceries, maintenance. Without David here, he really can't manage alone." Carol lowered her voice, but I still heard her. "Poor man." I stood in the kitchen holding a cup of coffee and realized Victoria wasn't merely mistaken about our finances. She was beginning to turn her mistake into a story other people believed. By noon, 2 relatives had called asking whether I needed help choosing an assisted living facility. One even told me Victoria was being very generous by giving me a full month. I thanked them and ended the calls without correcting anything. I wanted to know where Victoria's certainty came from. That afternoon, she placed a brochure on the dining table. Sunset Manor. Comfort, security, community. Several room options had been circled. I scheduled a tour for Tuesday. She said, "Cancel it." She looked surprised. "Thomas, we discussed this." "You discussed it." I listened. Her mouth tightened. "Where exactly do you think you're going?" "I haven't decided." "You don't have the income to rent something decent on Social Security." I looked at her carefully. "How much do you think I receive every month?" "I don't know. 2,000? Maybe a little more? And you think that's all I have?" Victoria gave me the patient smile people use when they believe an older person is embarrassed. "David told me enough." "What exactly did he tell you?" Her expression shifted. "That he took care of things." "Which things?" "Thomas, I'm not interrogating my dead husband because you don't like reality." She picked up the brochure and pushed it toward me. "Tuesday at 10. Then she walked away. I remained at the table thinking about David. My son had certainly allowed Victoria to misunderstand our arrangement, but I couldn't imagine him deliberately telling her I was dependent on him. David had always been private about money, especially during the difficult years after his business struggled. Maybe he had hidden more from his wife than I realized. That evening I noticed another change. My name had been removed from the small whiteboard near the kitchen where we listed household appointments. Under Saturday, Victoria had written, "Realtor, preliminary walkthrough, beneath Tuesday, Thomas, Sunset Manor, 2 appointments, 1 to prepare my home for sale, 1 to prepare me for removal." I erased neither. Instead, I walked through the house slowly after Victoria went upstairs. Every room held something she was beginning to remove. Margaret's photographs, David's childhood memories, pieces of a family history that existed long before Victoria entered it. When I reached the basement door, I stopped. Downstairs was the one part of the house she hadn't touched. My old office was still locked, and behind that door were decades of records she apparently didn't know existed. I rested my hand on the doorknob, but didn't open it. Not yet. Victoria had spent the entire day deciding where my memories belonged, where I would live, and what story everyone else would hear about me. I wanted to see how far she would go before she finally asked the one question that mattered. Who actually owns this house? 3 days later, Victoria sat across from me at the kitchen table with a calculator, a yellow legal pad, and a stack of bills she had taken from David's desk. "I finally understand why David was always worried about money," she said. I lowered my coffee. "Why?" She tapped the calculator. "Because of you." I said nothing. Victoria began listing numbers as if she were presenting evidence in court. Property taxes, electricity, insurance, groceries, repairs. She had added everything together and decided David had been spending nearly $40,000 a year keeping me comfortable. That's a lot of money, Thomas. It is. And now that David is gone, I can't continue carrying that burden. The word stayed between us. Burden. She had used it before, but this time she said it with the confidence of someone who believed numbers had proved her right. I looked at the papers. Which of those bills has David's name on it? Victoria frowned. What? The property tax. Whose name is on the statement? She glanced down. That isn't the point. Whose account paid it? David handled household finances. Then the bank statement should show the payment. Her expression tightened. Why are you making this difficult? I'm asking a simple question. I pulled the insurance bill toward me. Who is listed as the policyholder? She snatched it back. I don't have time for games. I leaned back. Neither do I. For the first time since the funeral, uncertainty appeared in her face. It lasted only a second. Then she recovered. David told me this house was his responsibility. Responsibility and ownership aren't the same thing. He maintained it for years. Did he? Of course he did. Then you should have records. She stared at me. I wasn't raising my voice. That seemed to irritate her more than anger would have. You know what your problem is? She said. You're too proud to admit how much David did for you. I looked at the empty chair where my son used to sit. David did a great deal for me. Just not what you think. Victoria pushed back from the table. There, that attitude. He protected you from reality, and now I'm the one who has to deal with it. What reality? That you're 72, you have Social Security, no real income, and a house you couldn't possibly afford without him. I almost corrected her. Instead, I asked, have you seen the deed? She blinked. The deed? To the house. David owned it. Have you seen it? We were married 12 years. That's not what I asked. Her jaw tightened. I don't need to prove my marriage to you. I'm not asking you to. I'm asking whether you've seen the deed. She gathered the papers abruptly. The realtor can handle all of that. Probably. And once the house is sold, this ridiculous argument will be over. I nodded. Then make sure your realtor checks the deed before putting up a sign. Victoria stared at me for several seconds, trying to decide whether I knew something she didn't. Then she smiled. Thomas, I understand this is frightening. Losing David, leaving the house, going somewhere new. But pretending you have some kind of control isn't going to change anything. I looked at her. Maybe not. That afternoon I heard her on the phone with Sunset Manor. She described me as independent, but financially dependent on family. She asked about monthly rates, medication management, and whether residents could move in on short notice. When the woman apparently asked who would be responsible for payment, Victoria paused. His Social Security should cover most of it. If not, we'll figure something out after the house sells. There it was again. The house was already money in her mind. By evening, she had placed another folder beside my chair, labeled Thomas, Moving. Inside was a checklist. Clothes, medications, personal documents, furniture allowed, items to donate. Near the bottom, she'd written bank information, pension, Social Security. I carried the folder into the living room. You want access to my bank information? Sunset Manor will need financial records. Then I'll give them whatever they need. It would be easier if I handled it. No. She looked genuinely offended. David handled everything. You keep saying that. Because it's true. I studied her for a moment. Then show me one check David wrote for my property taxes. Silence. One insurance premium. Nothing. One mortgage payment. Her face hardened. You don't even have a mortgage. I smiled slightly. That's the first correct thing you've said about my finances. Victoria stood. I'm trying to help you. Then stop guessing. She grabbed the folder from my hand. 30 days, Thomas. Don't make me become unpleasant about this. I watched her walk upstairs. She believed unpleasantness was something she hadn't started yet. That night, after the house went quiet, I stood outside the basement office with the key in my hand. Victoria wanted proof of who had paid for this house. She wanted bank records. She wanted to know what David had really contributed. For 37 years, I had saved exactly those answers. I unlocked the door, switched on the light, and walked toward the gray filing cabinet against the far wall. The gray filing cabinet hadn't moved in 22 years. Margaret used to tease me about it, saying I trusted paper more than people. That night, standing alone in the basement, I was beginning to understand why. I unlocked the top drawer and pulled out a folder marked 447 Maple Street, property. The first document inside was dated the 14th of May, 1987. My name appeared beneath the address, Thomas Mitchell, owner. I ran my thumb across the faded paper. I remembered signing it when Margaret and I were still young enough to believe 30 years was an eternity. We had bought the lot before David started high school. I had spent months working with contractors, arguing over materials, changing plans, and watching an empty piece of land slowly become our home. David hadn't purchased this house. He had grown up in it. I opened the next folder. Construction invoices, permits, closing documents, insurance policies. Then property tax statements arranged by year. 1988, 1989, 1990. Every payment traced back to my accounts. I kept going. New roof in 2003. Furnace replacement in 2009. Kitchen renovation after Margaret complained about the cabinets for 15 years. Plumbing repairs. Electrical upgrades. Homeowner's insurance. 37 years of ownership reduced to organized rows of paper. Not one document listed David as owner. Not one showed him paying the expenses Victoria claimed had drained him financially. I sat at my old desk and thought about the calculator she'd placed between us that morning. She had created an entire history from assumptions. $40,000 a year, David supporting me, Thomas the burden. Yet the documents in front of me told the opposite story. I pulled several recent bank statements. Property taxes had come directly from my account. Insurance too. Utilities were automatically paid from an account bearing my name. Even the grocery expenses Victoria believed David covered were mostly charged to my card. I almost laughed, but nothing about the situation felt funny. Victoria was preparing to sell property she'd never verified her right to sell. Worse, she was preparing to move me into assisted living because she believed I couldn't afford to live without my son. I could end that belief tomorrow morning. One deed placed on the breakfast table would be enough. But as I began returning the documents to their folders, I noticed another drawer. David. Financial. I stopped. That file had nothing to do with proving ownership of Maple Street. It contained records I hadn't reviewed since before David died. I opened it slowly. The first pages were ordinary. Old tax correspondence, business documents, several notes I'd kept when helping him reorganize his finances years earlier. Then I found transfers. My transfers. $5,000, $8,000, $12,000. Different dates, different reasons. Some went directly to David. Others went toward obligations connected to his business. I remembered each period separately, but I'd never looked at all of them together. David had struggled more than Victoria apparently knew. There had been a bad expansion, a contract dispute, months when cash flow tightened. Whenever he needed help, he'd come to me privately. I never considered it supporting him. He was my son. If I could help without harming him, I helped. But the irony was impossible to miss. Victoria had spent days telling people David carried me financially, while I was sitting above records, showing money repeatedly moving in the opposite direction. I kept reading. One transfer led me to another folder, then another. Eventually I reached the lower drawer, where Margaret and I had kept our estate planning documents. On the tab were 6 words I hadn't thought about in years. Thomas and Margaret Mitchell Family Trust. I pulled the folder halfway out, then stopped. Margaret and I had created the trust long before she became ill. David was connected to it, but after her death, I had left most of its administration to automatic systems and annual reviews. I suddenly realized Victoria might not know it existed. I checked the clock. Nearly midnight. Upstairs, the house was silent. I had come downstairs intending to prove one simple fact. I owned 447 Maple Street. I had done that within 10 minutes. But now another question had replaced it. If Victoria was wrong about who supported whom, how much else about David's finances had she misunderstood? I placed the deed, recent tax statements, insurance records, and several bank statements into a separate folder. Then I returned to the trust file. My hand rested on it for several seconds before I finally pulled it free. It was much thicker than I remembered. I didn't open it yet. That answer belonged to tomorrow. For tonight, I locked the property records in my desk and turned off the basement light. Victoria believed the most important thing hidden downstairs was proof that the house belonged to me. She was wrong. I just hadn't discovered how wrong yet. At 7 the next morning, I opened the family trust file and discovered that Victoria wasn't merely wrong about the house. She was wrong about almost everything. The first document was the original Thomas and Margaret Mitchell Family Trust, created 18 years earlier. Margaret and I were the grantors. After her death, I became the sole trustee. David was a beneficiary, not an owner, and Victoria's name appeared nowhere in the controlling documents. I turned through amendments, investment statements, distribution records, and annual reports until I reached the most recent valuation. I read the number twice. $853,412. I sat back slowly. That money wasn't some forgotten fortune. It represented decades of saving, investing, and protecting what Margaret and I had built. More importantly, the distribution records answered the question Victoria had been getting backward since the funeral. David had received help from the trust repeatedly. There was money during the difficult expansion of his business. Another distribution when a major client failed to pay him. Smaller amounts followed during periods when he needed breathing room. I pulled the records I'd found the night before and placed them beside the trust statements. The pattern was unmistakable. Money had flowed from me and the trust toward David, not from David toward me. I felt no satisfaction seeing it. David had never been a burden. He was my son. Helping him was something Margaret and I had prepared to do long before he ever needed it. What hurt was realizing he had apparently hidden those struggles from his wife. Victoria had spent days telling people that David sacrificed financially to support me, while the records showed that I had quietly protected him when his own finances became unstable. Then I found the insurance file. David had taken out a $150,000 life insurance policy years earlier. I expected Victoria to be the beneficiary. She wasn't. The beneficiary designation named the family trust. I checked the amendment date, then checked it again. Nothing had changed before his death. The insurance proceeds would flow into the trust I controlled. I closed the folder and stared at the wall. Victoria believed David had left her a house worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. He hadn't owned the house. She believed his life insurance belonged to her. It didn't. She believed David had supported me for years. The financial records showed the opposite. And somewhere upstairs, she was probably still planning which walls to repaint before selling my home. I heard footsteps overhead around 8. A few minutes later, Victoria called down the basement stairs. "Thomas, are you down there?" I closed the trust file. "Yes. The Sunset Manor tour is at 10. Don't forget." "I haven't. And a realtor is coming later this week. I need the basement presentable." I looked around at the rows of records surrounding me. "The basement is fine. Please don't make this harder than it needs to be." "I won't." She went upstairs. I remained at the desk. For a moment, I considered carrying everything into the kitchen. The deed, tax records, trust statements, transfer history, insurance designation. I could place them in front of her and watch certainty disappear from her face before breakfast. But doing that would answer only one question: whether I could prove her wrong. It wouldn't answer why she had been so willing to treat me as disposable without checking a single fact. So I put the trust file back in the cabinet and locked it. I took only copies of the documents I would eventually need. Later that morning, Victoria drove to Sunset Manor alone after I refused to go. When she returned, she was furious. "You embarrassed me." "How?" "I scheduled that appointment for you, without asking me. Because somebody has to make decisions now that David is gone." I looked at her carefully. "Why you?" "Because I'm his wife." "That doesn't make you responsible for me. David was responsible for you." There it was again. I could almost predict the words now. "Are you sure?" I asked. "I lived with him for 12 years. That's not what I asked." She slammed her handbag onto the counter. I am tired of these little riddles, Thomas. Then stop assuming and start checking. Her eyes narrowed. Checking what? Everything. For a second, something uncertain moved across her face. Then the doorbell rang. It was a woman from Victoria's real estate office dropping off market reports. Victoria immediately changed tone. Within minutes, they were standing in the living room discussing comparable sales. I heard Victoria say, "Once Thomas is settled, I'll probably modernize the kitchen before listing." The woman asked, "Is title already transferred from David's estate?" Silence followed. "It will be handled," Victoria said. I smiled to myself. Finally, someone besides me had asked the right question. That evening, I checked the locks on my basement office and placed copies of the trust documents in a separate envelope. I wasn't ready to use them yet. Victoria still believed she was dealing with an old man who had no money, no options, and nowhere else to go. She had no idea that the man she called a burden controlled the house beneath her feet. A trust worth $853,412, and the $150,000 she thought David had left behind. And the more certain she became, the less careful she was becoming. Victoria brought 3 real estate agents into my house Saturday morning without asking me. I was making coffee when I heard a camera shutter in the living room. "Once Thomas is gone, I'll replace these floors and brighten everything up," she was saying. I stepped into the hallway and found 3 people from Premier Realty photographing the home Margaret and I had spent 37 years building. Victoria barely looked embarrassed. "It's just a preliminary walkthrough. For a house you haven't proved you own?" The room went quiet. One of the agents lowered her phone. Victoria forced a smile. "Thomas is having difficulty with the transition." I picked up my coffee. "Please continue." For the next 15 minutes, I followed while she planned my disappearance room by room. Margaret's wallpaper would go. My workshop could become a guest suite. The kitchen needed modernization. She even discussed which furniture should remain after I moved to Sunset Manor. Upstairs, one agent finally asked, "Do you have the deed and probate documents from David's estate?" Victoria hesitated. "My attorney will handle everything. We'll need title confirmed before listing. There won't be a problem." I said nothing. Back downstairs, the conversation turned to price. And then, inevitably, to me. "Will Mr. Mitchell stay during renovations?" someone asked. Victoria laughed softly. "No. He's moving into assisted living. That decision hasn't been made," I said. Her smile tightened. "Thomas, please. You brought strangers into my home. I think I'm allowed to participate." Victoria's cheeks reddened. "This is exactly what I've been dealing with. David handled everything for him, and now Thomas refuses to accept that things have changed." One agent shifted uncomfortably. I asked, "Everything?" "Bills, food, maintenance, taxes. David spent years supporting you. And you verified that?" I was his wife. That wasn't my question. Her embarrassment turned into anger. "Do we really need to do this now? You chose the audience." Nobody spoke. Victoria folded her arms. "Fine. David probably spent $40,000 a year keeping this household running while you lived here on Social Security." I looked at the 3 agents. Then, there should be records. Victoria stared at me. "Why are you trying to humiliate me? I'm asking you to check your facts." "I know the facts." "Then whose name is on the deed?" That stopped her. The female agent glanced between us. "Victoria, we really should verify title before discussing renovations." David owned the house. "Then verification should be simple," I said. Victoria stepped closer. "You know what your problem is, Thomas? You can't accept how dependent you were on your son." I remained silent. She continued because she thought silence meant she was winning. "David carried you for years. I loved him, but I'm not going to spend the rest of my life doing the same. You're 72. You have Social Security and nowhere else to go, and somehow you still think everyone owes you something." One of her coworkers quietly said her name, warning her to stop. She didn't. "I'm sorry if the truth hurts, but you became a burden to David. I won't let you become mine." The room went completely still. I looked at Victoria for several seconds. Until then, I had been willing to blame grief for some of her behavior. But grief hadn't made her bring 3 agents into a property she hadn't verified. Grief hadn't forced her to discuss removing my wife's memories or announce my finances to strangers. And grief certainly hadn't prevented her from checking a deed after I had repeatedly told her to do exactly that. "Are you finished?" I asked. She seemed surprised by how calmly I said it. "Thomas, before anyone photographs another room, check the deed." The female agent nodded. "That would be standard procedure anyway." Victoria laughed dismissively. "Fine, check whatever you want." "Good." I walked toward the stairs. Behind me, she told them to continue, but the mood had changed. The agents were no longer discussing renovations with the same enthusiasm. 20 minutes later, their cars left my driveway. Victoria remained outside on the phone, pacing angrily. I went downstairs instead. The basement office was exactly as I'd left it. I unlocked the filing cabinet and removed 4 things. The original deed to 447 Maple Street, the payment history, the family trust records, and David's life insurance beneficiary designation. I arranged them across my desk. Victoria had just called me a burden in front of 3 people who understood property transactions for a living. Soon they would understand something else, too. I opened the bottom desk drawer and found a business card I had kept for years. Margaret Collins, attorney at law. Margaret had handled our estate planning long before my wife became ill. If anyone knew how to end this cleanly, it was her. I dialed. She answered on the 4th ring. "Thomas, it's been a while. I need some help." "What happened?" I looked at the deed beneath my hand. "My daughter-in-law is trying to sell my house." There was a pause. "Your house?" "Yes." "Does she know that?" I looked toward the ceiling, where Victoria was still walking around, as though 447 Maple Street already belonged to her. "Not yet." Monday morning, I walked into Margaret Collins's office, carrying 37 years of proof in 3 folders. She didn't offer me sympathy or tell me to calm down. She simply closed her office door, put on her glasses, and said, "Show me everything." I started with the deed. Margaret read the first page and looked up. Sole owner. Thomas Mitchell. No transfer to David. No joint ownership. Correct. Next came the tax statements, insurance records, utility payments, renovation invoices, and bank records. She worked through them methodically. 37 years? Every year. And Victoria believes David paid these? She's told half the neighborhood he did. Margaret shook her head. Then I placed the family trust file in front of her. She recognized it immediately because she had helped Margaret and me establish it years earlier. After reviewing the latest statements, she tapped the balance with her pen. $853,412. You're still sole trustee? Yes. David was beneficiary only? Yes. Finally, I handed her the life insurance designation. She read it twice. The trust is beneficiary of the full $150,000. I nodded. Margaret removed her glasses. Thomas, what exactly does Victoria think she inherited? The house, the insurance, and apparently responsibility for supporting me. Margaret stared at me for a moment. She hasn't checked any of this? I've asked her repeatedly to check the deed, and instead, she brought 3 agents from Premier Realty into my house Saturday and told them I was a financial burden David had supported for years. Margaret leaned back. What do you want from me? I had thought about that question all weekend. First, confirm the deed and make sure there is no legal path for Victoria to claim ownership through David's estate. Easy enough. Second, process the insurance proceeds according to the beneficiary designation and verify the trust remains exactly as written. She made a note. And third, I looked down at the folders. I want Victoria out of my house. Margaret stopped writing. Immediately? No. 30 days. She understood the significance. That's how long she gave you. Exactly. Thomas, we can handle this without turning it into revenge. It isn't revenge. She needs somewhere to go, and 30 days is reasonable. I'm giving her the same courtesy she believed she was giving me. Margaret studied me, then nodded. Fair. She began outlining the cleanest legal approach. Victoria had lived at Maple Street with David, so Margaret wanted everything documented properly, rather than relying on an argument at the kitchen table. Ownership would be confirmed. Written notice would be prepared. The trust and insurance would remain separate from Victoria's assumptions about David's estate. Once she sees this, Margaret said, there won't be much to debate. There will be. Why? Because Victoria doesn't have a problem with documents. She has a problem admitting she can be wrong. Margaret closed the deed folder. Then let the documents speak. That gave me an idea. I thought about the 3 agents standing in my living room while Victoria called me a Burton. They had heard her say David paid the taxes. They had heard her claim the house was his. And one of them had been professional enough to ask about title before listing it. Can we have this conversation at Premier Realty? Margaret raised an eyebrow. Why there? Because Victoria made my finances public there, before checking them. I don't want rumors corrected one person at a time afterward. You want witnesses. I want the same people who heard her version to hear the facts. Margaret was quiet for several seconds. No spectacle. No humiliation. Agreed. We present only what we can prove. That's all I want. She picked up the phone and asked her assistant to prepare certified copies of the deed and trust documents. Before I left, Margaret handed me a draft notice. At the top was Victoria's name. Near the bottom were the words, 30 days to vacate. I stared at them longer than I expected. David would have hated what was happening between us. That thought hurt more than anything Victoria had said. Still want to do this? Margaret asked. I don't want to throw my son's widow into the street. Then don't. But I also won't let her throw me out of my own home. Margaret nodded. Those are 2 different things. I folded the notice and put it back into the folder. That afternoon, Victoria called while I was driving home. Where have you been? Taking care of paperwork. What paperwork? House matters. There was a pause. I already told you my office is handling the sale. I know. Then stop interfering. I almost told her everything. Instead, I asked, will you be at Premier Realty tomorrow afternoon? Of course. Why? Good. I'll stop by. Thomas, I don't have time for another argument. Neither do I. I ended the call before she could respond. On the passenger seat beside me were certified records covering 37 years, a trust worth $853,412, a $150,000 beneficiary designation, and a notice giving Victoria exactly 30 days. For the first time since David's funeral, I wasn't waiting to see what she would do next. Tomorrow, she was going to see what I had done. At 2:30 the next afternoon, I walked into Premier Realty, carrying nothing but my coat. Margaret Collins followed 10 seconds later with the folders. Victoria was standing near the conference room with the same 3 agents who had toured my house Saturday. The moment she saw me, her expression hardened. Thomas, what are you doing here? You said your office was handling the house. I thought this was the right place to discuss it. Then she noticed Margaret. Who is she? Margaret extended her hand. Margaret Collins. I'm Thomas Mitchell's attorney. The room changed immediately. Victoria didn't shake it. Attorney? For what? 447 Maple Street. One of the agents quietly closed the conference room door. Margaret placed the first folder on the table. Victoria, before anyone spends additional time preparing this property for sale, we need to correct several misunderstandings regarding ownership. Victoria folded her arms. There is no misunderstanding. The house belonged to my husband. Margaret opened the folder. No, it didn't. Silence. She slid a certified copy of the deed across the table. 447 Maple Street was purchased by Thomas Mitchell in 1987. He remains the sole recorded owner. There was never a transfer to David Mitchell, and the property is not part of David's estate. Victoria stared at the page, without touching it. That can't be right. You're welcome to verify it independently. The female agent who had questioned title on Saturday leaned forward and read the document. Her expression told Victoria the same thing Margaret had. But David maintained the house, Victoria said. He paid for everything. I remained silent. Margaret opened the second folder. We checked that too. She laid out copies of tax statements, insurance records, and payment histories. Property taxes were paid from accounts belonging to Thomas. Homeowner's insurance was paid by Thomas. Major repairs and improvements were paid by Thomas. The records we reviewed covered decades. Victoria looked at me. David told me he was responsible for this house. Maybe he meant something different, I said. You never asked. I was his wife, and I was his father. Neither one of those titles changes a deed. One of the agents looked down at the table. Another quietly pushed his phone away. Nobody seemed comfortable anymore. Victoria turned to Margaret. Thomas lives on Social Security. Where exactly do you think all this money came from? Margaret didn't react to the insult. That brings us to the second misunderstanding. She opened another section of the records. You repeatedly stated that David financially supported Thomas. We found no evidence supporting that claim. Victoria laughed nervously. Then your records are incomplete. Margaret slid several transfer statements toward her. These are transfers involving David during periods when he experienced financial difficulty. Notice the direction of the funds. Victoria looked down. Her face slowly changed. I could see her reading my name, then David's, then the amounts. What are these? Help, I said. When David needed it. He never told me. Apparently not. How much? I didn't answer immediately. This wasn't a victory I enjoyed. Enough to help him through difficult years. Victoria looked through several pages faster now. Why would he hide this from me? I don't know. That was the truth. Margaret continued before the conversation could turn into speculation. The relevant point is that the evidence does not support the claim that David spent approximately $40,000 a year supporting Thomas. Victoria looked toward her colleagues. Saturday she had made that claim confidently in front of them. Now the same people were watching the paper dismantle it. This is private family business, she said. It became relevant here when preparations began to list property your husband never owned, Margaret replied. We are correcting the ownership record before your colleagues perform additional work based on inaccurate information. Victoria pushed the deed away. Fine. The house is Thomas's. That doesn't change David's estate. Margaret closed the first folder. Correct. It doesn't. Something in her tone made Victoria stop. What does that mean? It means we should distinguish carefully between assets David actually owned and assets you assumed belonged to him. Victoria looked at me. What else have you done? Nothing to you. You brought a lawyer into my office. After you brought your office into my house, her cheeks reddened. You planned this. I asked you to check the deed several times. You could have just shown it to me. And you could have looked. That ended the argument for a moment. Margaret gathered the property records into a neat stack. There is one additional matter regarding your continued residence at Maple Street. But before we address it, Thomas wanted the ownership issue made absolutely clear. She turned the certified deed toward Victoria once more. The house belongs to Thomas Mitchell. It always has. Victoria sank into the chair opposite us. The confidence she'd carried since David's funeral was disappearing, but she still seemed to be calculating. I knew what she was thinking because I had heard her mention it more than once. Even without the house, she believed David had left her enough money to begin again. She looked at me and said quietly, "You think this changes everything?" David still left me his financial assets. Margaret glanced at me. I gave her a small nod. She opened the final folder but kept her hand over the first page. Victoria, before you make another assumption, I strongly recommend you listen carefully. For the first time since David died, my daughter-in-law said nothing. Margaret turned the folder toward her. At the top of the document were the words Thomas and Margaret Mitchell Family Trust. Victoria stared at the title. Then her eyes moved to the balance printed beneath it. $853,412. Her face went completely still. What is that? She whispered. Margaret looked directly at her. That is the part of David's financial situation you apparently never knew existed. Victoria stared at the number printed on the trust statement. $853,412. David had this? She whispered. No, I said. That's what you still don't understand. Margaret turned the document toward her. The Thomas and Margaret Mitchell Family Trust was established by Thomas and his late wife. Thomas is the sole trustee. David was a beneficiary, not the owner. Victoria looked through the pages quickly. But I'm David's wife. His share should pass to me. Not under these terms, Margaret said. This trust is not part of David's estate. Victoria's face tightened. In less than 20 minutes, the future she had constructed since the funeral was disappearing piece by piece. First, the house. Now, the $853,412 she hadn't even known existed. Then, she suddenly looked up. The life insurance. Margaret remained silent. David had a $150,000 policy. For the first time since we arrived, relief crossed Victoria's face. That belongs to me. Margaret opened another document. Have you seen the beneficiary designation? The relief vanished. Victoria took the page. Her eyes moved down until they stopped on one line. Beneficiary, Thomas and Margaret Mitchell Family Trust. No, she read it again. David would have changed this after we married. We confirmed the current designation, Margaret said. The proceeds are payable to the trust. Victoria pushed the paper away. So Thomas gets everything? That word finally made something inside me tighten. Everything? I repeated. She looked at me. Victoria, my son is dead. I would give away this house, every dollar in that trust, and everything else I own if it brought David back. Don't confuse paperwork with winning. The room became silent. I continued more quietly. You spent the days after his funeral deciding what you believed he left you. I spent them trying to understand why I had to bury my child. Victoria lowered her eyes. Margaret allowed the silence to sit before speaking again. Any assets David actually owned will be handled properly through his estate. But 447 Maple Street was never his. The family trust was never his. And the insurance goes to the beneficiary David designated. I wasn't taking anything from Victoria. That mattered to me. I was simply refusing to let her claim things that had never belonged to David in the first place. Victoria looked toward her co-workers. The same people who had heard her call me a burden were now staring at the documents that proved nearly every assumption she'd made was wrong. I made a mistake, she said. Several, I replied. You could have corrected me. I tried. She looked up. No, you asked questions. Exactly. I asked who owned the house. I asked who paid the taxes. I told you to check the deed. You never did. Margaret reached into her folder and removed one final envelope. There is one remaining matter. Victoria looked at it suspiciously. What is that? Margaret placed it in front of her. Formal notice regarding your occupancy at 447 Maple Street. Victoria stared at me. You're throwing me out? I'm asking you to move. How long? 30 days. She went completely still. She remembered immediately. You did that deliberately. Yes. Because I gave you 30 days? Because you believed 30 days was enough time for a 72-year-old man to leave the home he'd lived in for 37 years. I assume it's enough time for you too. Victoria opened the envelope with shaking hands. Where am I supposed to go? That's your decision. David would never have wanted this. I swallowed before answering. David would never have wanted either of us standing here. She looked down again. Then why are you doing it? Because I can forgive you for being wrong. I can't continue living with someone who decided my age made me disposable. The words landed harder than any accusation I'd made. Victoria stopped arguing. Margaret explained that the notice would be handled properly and that Victoria could remove her personal belongings and anything from David's estate legally belonging to her. I added one thing. Margaret's photographs stay. Victoria nodded. And David's things? Anything clearly yours, take it. Anything uncertain, we sort out properly. No fighting. For the first time, she seemed to understand that I wasn't trying to punish her financially. I wasn't taking David's possessions or manipulating his estate. I was drawing a boundary around what was mine. Margaret closed the folders. The confrontation was finished. Victoria had entered that room, believing she was the widow of a man who had left her a valuable house and $150,000, while his dependent father needed somewhere else to live. She was leaving with the truth. I owned the house. I had supported David when he struggled. The $853,412 trust remained under my control. The $150,000 insurance was payable to that trust, and she had 30 days to leave. 447 Maple Street. I stood to go. Victoria remained seated with the notice in front of her. At the conference room door, I stopped and looked back. She seemed smaller somehow, not because she'd lost money, but because certainty had finally been replaced by facts. I didn't smile. I didn't celebrate. David was still dead, and nothing in those folders could change that. I simply left the office with Margaret, knowing the argument over what belonged to whom was finally over. What happened between Victoria and me after those 30 days would be something neither deed nor trust could decide. Victoria moved out on the 28th day. There was no argument, no final threat, and no moving truck blocking the driveway while neighbors gathered to watch. At 8 that morning, she carried the last box from the house, placed it in her car, and stood beside the open door for several seconds. "Everything of David's that we weren't sure about is still upstairs," she said. "Thank you." She nodded toward the house. "I really did believe it belonged to him." "I know. That doesn't excuse what I did." I didn't answer. For once, Victoria wasn't asking me to. She got into her car and drove away. I stood in the driveway until the taillights disappeared, then went back inside. The house was quiet again, but it wasn't the peaceful quiet I remembered from before David died. His absence was everywhere. For weeks, Victoria and I had been fighting over deeds, money, insurance, and who had the right to stay beneath that roof. Now that the fight was over, none of those things felt particularly important. I would have traded every document in the basement for one more breakfast with my son. The consequences for Victoria came without any help from me. Premier Realty had learned that she had begun discussing renovations and a possible listing before verifying ownership. Her colleagues had also witnessed what happened when Margaret produced the deed. Within weeks, several clients requested other agents. Victoria eventually left the firm. I didn't celebrate that either. She had made professional decisions based on assumptions, and the consequences belonged to her. I had no interest in making them worse. 3 weeks after she moved out, my doorbell rang. Victoria stood outside holding a cardboard box. "Can I come in?" she asked. I stepped aside. She carried the box into the living room and placed it on the coffee table. Inside were photographs of Margaret, David's childhood pictures, several family letters, and Margaret's handwritten recipe cards, the things Victoria had packed away after the funeral. "I found these mixed in with my boxes," she said. I picked up one of the recipes. Margaret's handwriting stopped me for a moment. Victoria looked toward the floor. "I'm sorry, Thomas." I waited. "Not because of the house. Not because of the trust. I'm sorry because I decided who you were without ever asking." She swallowed. "I thought David was supporting you. Then I turned that assumption into permission to treat you like you didn't matter." I looked at her. "You were grieving too." Grief didn't put Margaret's photographs in a trash bag. Her voice broke slightly. "I did that. That was the first apology she'd given me without explaining it away." She sat across from me. "I keep thinking about what would have happened if the deed really had been David's." "What do you mean?" "I still would have treated you the same way." She wiped her eyes. "That's the part I can't defend." I understood. The lesson wasn't that she should respect me because I owned the house or controlled $853,412. If money was the reason she changed, then nothing meaningful had changed at all. "Victoria, I don't need you to be ashamed forever." She looked up. "But I do need you to understand something. I wasn't worthy of respect because my name was on a deed. I was worthy of respect before you knew that." She nodded. "I know. And being 72 didn't make me helpless. I know that too." We sat quietly for a while. Eventually she asked, "Can you ever forgive me?" I thought about David. He had loved both of us, imperfectly and perhaps too privately. Forgiveness wouldn't mean pretending the previous month hadn't happened. It wouldn't mean inviting Victoria to move back or giving her access to my finances. It simply meant I didn't want anger to become the last thing connecting two people who had loved the same man. "Yes," I said. "But forgiveness and trust aren't the same thing." She nodded slowly. "I understand." Before leaving, Victoria stopped beside the mantel and returned Margaret's wedding photograph to the place where it had always stood. Then she touched the frame containing a picture of David as a boy. "He should have told me," she whispered. "Maybe." I stood beside her. "And maybe we both should have asked him more questions." She gave me a sad smile and left. Months passed. Victoria and I didn't become close, but we became civil. Occasionally she called. Sometimes we talked about David. I kept 447 Maple Street exactly as it was. I didn't sell it, and I didn't renovate away the memories. The trust remained protected, the insurance proceeds went where David had designated them, and I continued managing my own life exactly as I had before anyone decided I couldn't. One evening, I sat on the porch watching the light fade across the yard. Margaret and I had planted decades earlier. I thought about the 30 days Victoria had given me, and how easily I could have answered cruelty with cruelty, but I had learned something during those weeks. Strength doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it keeps records. Sometimes it asks one quiet question and waits for the truth to catch up. And sometimes it forgives without surrendering the boundary that made forgiveness possible. Victoria had mistaken my silence for weakness because she believed the loudest person in the room held the power. She was wrong. Quiet doesn't mean weak. Respect isn't inherited with a house, demanded through marriage, or measured by the balance in a bank account. It is earned by how we treat people when we believe they have nothing we need.